Shalom and welcome back to Pearls of the Torah. I'm Moreh Matan, Pastor Matt McKeown, and I'm so glad to be back with you this week as we dive into the pearls of the Torah. This week, of course, we are in Parashat Vayigash, and before we move on, I just want to thank you for participating in our Hanukkah nightly broadcasts and tell you to please continue contributing to Operation 70. We want to make sure that we get all of Rabbi Shapira's teachings in as many languages as possible. And obviously, this is a costly thing to do. We can use technology to do it, but it is expensive. So please help us do this, as just like Shavuot, we will see the Word of God go out in many different languages. We hope that you have had a blessed Hanukkah season, and as that comes to a close, we pray continued blessings of shalom on you and your family. Let us dive into the Torah this week as we start in Genesis 44, verse 18, and we see Judah approaching Joseph. Now, as always, we are looking at Or HaChaim this Torah cycle. We're going through the entire Torah, looking at the Or HaChaim's commentary. And we want to look at this idea of approached. It says, then Judah approached him and said. So the Or HaChaim says that there are multiple meanings of the word approach. He highlights that Judah's approach can be understood to be physical, verbal, as well as emotional. He notes that the possibility is there that Judah was also appealing to higher justice, invoking both diplomacy and prayer in his plea. Remember, we've talked about this in previous Torah portions, that we are leading up to this moment where Judah is going to be a guarantor for his brother. The Or HaChaim also mentions Judah's courage. He remarks that Judah's boldness stemmed from a sense of responsibility for Benjamin and the desire to protect his father, reflecting the transformative character growth Judah had undergone. Remember, Joseph has been testing his brothers. He put the cup in one of their sacks, and this is why Benjamin is accused. He put it in Benjamin's sack and said, no, I'm going to keep him here. And this is why Judah is trying to stand in the place of Benjamin. And there are rabbis that say that this is why it is from the line of Judah that the Messiah will come, that this idea of standing in the gap for his brother is quite foreshadowing, as it has to do with the Messiah. And then we have the climax of the Joseph narrative, in my opinion, which is the revealing of Joseph to his brothers. This is in Genesis 45, verse 1. And I love the Torah's language here. Joseph could not restrain himself before all who stood by him. He just couldn't take it anymore. And the Or HaChaim says that there is an overwhelming emotion happening here. The Or HaChaim explains that Joseph's emotional outburst was the culmination of God's plan, revealing the depth of brotherly connection still alive despite years of separation. And we should probably mention not just years of separation, but the treatment that Joseph had at the hands of his brothers. The Or HaChaim also brings up the divine timing of all of this and speaks about Joseph's inability to hold back any longer, and how that is portrayed as the exact moment that God had arranged for the reconciliation to occur. We talked about this last week in the Torah portion as well, as if God is an orchestra conductor, that he's putting all of the pieces in place, arranging everything for the right moment, and this ensures the family's unity before they descend into Egypt, which is, of course, something that's very important as well. We don't have to mention again about the depth of the comparisons that we can make between Joseph and Messiah, son of Joseph. Now, we see in Genesis chapter 45:5, our third point this week is God's hidden plan in Joseph's journey. And what's amazing to me, and we mentioned this last week as well, is that Joseph is completely at home with the idea that even though his brothers meant something for evil, that God meant it for good, and not just for his good, but for the saving of many lives. So that's what it says here in this verse. Now do not be distressed. That, I think, goes a step farther than we're even talking about here, because he not only is at home with the idea that God meant it for good, he's not only accepted that as a fact and come to terms with it, but he also does not want his brothers to be distressed about it. That's above and beyond, I think. It really shows the true character of Joseph. Do not be distressed. And then, of course, he says beyond that, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. Now, the Or HaChaim says this: Joseph has a providential perspective. The Or HaChaim emphasizes Joseph's insight that every hardship was orchestrated by God for a greater purpose. Now, also, we see in Or HaChaim his comment that Joseph is trying to relieve the guilt of his brothers. His reassurance to them reflects the theme that human actions, although they may appear cruel, can serve as divine ends when part of God's larger plan. That is the thing that we've been saying for the last few weeks as Joseph has been dealing with this terrible situation. We've been hearkening back to Rabbi Shapira's book, The Besorah, or The Good News According to COVID-19, and how sometimes we go through a very difficult time, even something tragic, even something worldwide like a pandemic. And in that moment, the spiritually mature among us will ask God, what are you trying to teach us through this? What are we supposed to learn through this, rather than simply trying to pray the plague away? Maybe this is a natural consequence for behavior that we have been doing. Maybe it's a plague sent by God. Maybe it's something to test and refine our faith. Let's look at number 4, Jacob's response to Joseph's survival. Now remember, we know from our rabbis that he always held out hope that Joseph was still alive. When it says that there is food in Egypt or there's grain in Egypt, remember one way to interpret that is there is a son in Egypt. This is what Rabbi Shapira has taught us. Now in Genesis 45, 26 and 27, it says they told him, Joseph is still alive, but his heart went numb, for he did not believe them. When they recounted all that Joseph had said, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. We see this beautiful connection between father and son, as one of the first things that Joseph says is my father still alive? Does my father still live? This is something that is so important. The Or HaChaim says that there is a revival of the spirit that happens here. The Or HaChaim sees Jacob's initial disbelief as shock, followed by spiritual rejuvenation when he perceives the truth. What a wonderful way to put that. Couldn't you and I use some spiritual rejuvenation when we perceive the truth? This is what happens when we study the Torah and we understand the truth. We have a spiritual rejuvenation. Could we even call it a revival? After all, in English, that's what it says here in this version. The spirit of their father Jacob revived. So revival can happen when we perceive the truth and get over the shock. We also see signs from Joseph. According to Or HaChaim, Jacob's soul was reinvigorated not merely by the news, but by the confirmation that Joseph's righteousness remained intact. And this was the key to Jacob's joy. What a beautiful statement there. Point number 5, as we continue on, Jacob's descent into Egypt. In Genesis chapter 46, verses 2 and 3, it says, God spoke to Israel in visions of the night. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. Now the Or HaChaim says that this is reassurance from God, and he highlights God's direct address to Jacob, soothing his fears about leaving the promised land. They must go down into Egypt. This is God's bigger overarching plan. They've got to go down into Egypt so they can come back up out of Egypt. We also see a fulfillment of the covenant. The descent into Egypt is framed as a part of the divine promise to Abraham. Remember, it says that your family will go down and they will be ruled over or possessed by another people, and then they will come out with great riches. This ensures the growth of Israel as a great nation, even in exile. There's something about the Jewish people and the thriving that can happen even in exile. It's something that is true and has always been true about Israel, about the Jewish people. It's part of God's covenant with them. Then we see something very happy. Point number 6, the reunion with Joseph. In Genesis 46:29, it said, Joseph harnessed his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father. He fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Now the Or HaChaim says that we see two things at work here. Number one is mutual yearning. Or HaChaim describes the reunion as the consummation of a deep longing on both sides, from father to son and son to father, this symbolizes the mending of a fractured family. This is something that is so inspirational to us because many of us deal with families or family members that are exiled, or perhaps we have even been exiled from a family. Sometimes when someone comes to faith, they're even sort of they have their back turned on them. Their family turns their back on them when they come to faith. Or sometimes, unfortunately, when someone leaves the faith, there sometimes is an anger and a bitterness that is there, rather than the attitude of the father of the lost son that is longing for the prodigal to return home. So we must be very careful when family comes into play as far as stress in the relationship. Something that my father has always said is that everything rises and falls on relationships. And something that I really appreciate about Rabbi Shapira is he feels the exact same way, that relationship is the most important thing. And anything we can do to mend those bridges is a good thing. We also see with the Or HaChaim here the holiness of tears. The intense weeping is interpreted as sacred release, reflecting on God's mercy in restoring father and son. Remember, we learn in the yeshiva about this acrostic about my gates will open with tears. And we read in the book of Hebrews that Yeshua wept over the people and the things that he was praying for, that he prayed with deep tears. This is something that is very important. It's a concept in Judaism about the gates of the Lord opening with tears. We have that in the message of the mezuzah and getting into the name of El Shaddai and other things that have to do with that in Biblical Hebrew and Jewish Thought Level 1 in our yeshiva. A little commercial for you to sign up for that. Fill out an application at shuvu.tv. We also see here this settlement in Goshen. It's the good land. This is point number 7, the settlement in Goshen. In Genesis 47:6, it says, the land of Egypt is open before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. And that's what Goshen was. And the Or HaChaim says this shows divine favor and strategic choice. Pharaoh's generosity is seen as part of God's plan to protect and nurture the Israelites. And you see what happens. They become numerous, they prosper, they become fruitful, and they multiply in this good land that they are given. Also, we see the strategic choice. The Or HaChaim notes that Goshen was chosen for its separateness, enabling the Israelites to preserve their identity and to avoid cultural assimilation. And as we are finishing off the observance of Chanukah, what a wonderful thing that we are doing. You know, we always are in these Torah portions at Chanukah time. And so this idea of being separate, and remember that's what the word holy really means, to be set apart, to be separate. We are to be different and set apart. And this was very strategic, that this allowed them to be the separate ones. And then finally, point number 8 this week, flourishing despite exile. We talked a little bit about this just a moment ago. It says there in Genesis 47:27, thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt. They acquired holdings there and were fertile and increased greatly. This is such a blessing. Isn't it interesting that a blessing to one person might be looked at by an enemy of that person as a curse? What is the number one complaint that Pharaoh had when he wanted to get rid of the Jewish people? First of all, just to make them slaves. What was the idea behind that? They have become too numerous. So the blessing is looked at by the enemy of Israel as a curse. You remember that Jethro, before he was known as Jethro, was known as Jether, and he was one of 5 of Pharaoh's advisors. He was the only one that was against making them slaves. One of the other advisors said, let's just kill them. Let's get rid of them. Another said, let's enslave them. But Jether did not agree, and so he left Pharaoh's court and settled in Midian, becoming the high priest of Midian, and then eventually becoming known as Jethro and becoming the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu. This is yet again a way that God's plan is working everything out ahead of time. Now, the Or HaChaim says that they receive blessing in foreign land. The Or HaChaim observes that God's favor was evident, even in exile, ensuring prosperity for Jacob's descendants. And lastly, there is an anticipation of redemption. The growth in Egypt, through a blessing, foreshadows the eventual enslavement and the need for future deliverance, which is an integral stage in Israel's history. Although it seems difficult, there cannot be a redemption unless there is an exile. We must have a galut in order for there to be a geulah. We are in galut, the last exile, right now. And we are looking forward to the day when Mashiach will return. And he will allow us to partner with him in setting everything right. We are to prepare the way for him. May he come soon and in our days. Thank you so much for joining with me every single week as we dive into the depths of the Torah here at Pearls of the Torah. Thank you so much for subscribing to our channel. Please share these teachings on your social media so that as many people as possible can be blessed by them. We thank you for your continued financial support, especially with Operation 70. Let us continue to contribute. We, at last count, were still over $20,000 off from the stated goal of $50,000. This will help us using technology to get Rabbi Shapira's teachings into as many languages as possible. Let us donate and be generous to get this teaching out to the world. Thank you so much for joining me. Shalom and Kol Tuv.